The layout system we're going to talk about is relatively new. It's called CSS Grid. First of all, let's look at w3schools.com. This particular site I've mentioned before because it has great reference material for doing anything with HTML and CSS. This particular section is on what's called the CSS Grid layout module, and it's much of what we're going to be going over here today. There's this website that I created that I've also made available on CSS Grid, sections including web layout history, and of course some of the weaknesses of the old methods. We talk in here about the box model. We tried to understand what was going on with floats such as this and how that could also be used for layouts. The weaknesses of floats, the need to clear floats. The major thing that's happened that's made it more difficult to do good design has been the adoption of smartphones, which were really introduced in 2007 when Apple came out with the iPhone. Smartphone penetration increased rapidly, and today, in many instances, websites are being viewed more often on a phone or maybe a tablet, but let's say a phone, small mobile device, than they are on laptop or desktop computers. And the challenge, of course, is in the old days, we used to design just for computers. We could know what the resolution was of the lowest standard computer. We could design pages for that width, and they never needed to do anything else. But as, of course, tablets and smartphones came out, the problem has become if you take a layout like this one, which is intended for the laptop and desktop, and it has 4 pictures on one row, for example, by the time you put that layout onto a tablet and certainly onto a smartphone, it becomes so small that you have to pinch and zoom to even see the pictures at all. So what's happening here is what's called responsive web design, which is doing CSS in such a way that you can have multiple layouts based on what are called breakpoints. Breakpoints are the resolution of different devices, such as a laptop, desktop. We might start on a mobile phone and look at that layout. First of all, you notice that these images are pretty much stacked one on top of another so that they don't become too small. So it's really a one-column layout. Whereas on the tablet, we have a little more screen real estate. We could do maybe 2 pictures on a row, and then of course on the laptop, desktop, you could do 4. It's been a challenge doing layouts like this with the layout tools we've had before CSS Grid. So you can look at the rest of this. I do address what are called frameworks on here, which are still very useful. Perhaps the most popular one is called Bootstrap. There are others, for example, Foundation, the 960 grid system, which really comes with a bunch of pre-written CSS so that you can write HTML to target those pre-written class names and do some layout that would have been much more difficult if you had to write all the CSS on your own. Flexbox is addressed here, and then of course CSS Grid is talked about down here and browser support for that. Another good site I'll point out is a site called Grid by Example by Rachel Andrew. She was an early proponent of CSS, worked with the standards makers to see that the system would become adopted, and this site is very good as well for a resource and for learning CSS. So let's learn some basic CSS. So we're going to go back and look at the folder where we have our files. I'm going to hit Windows D on my Windows machine. I'm going to go to the Learning folder. And you should have a bunch of files in here that we've been creating for learning various things along the way. There should be an Images folder in here as well, and so you should have all of that. What I want to do is start with my file called setup.html, because remember, that's the file that has the basics HTML written into it, so I don't have to type it all over again. So I'm going to open that with brackets. And I'm going to immediately save it. And we're going to do File, Save As. And we're going to call it cssgrid.html. Now, I already have a file called that. You don't, so I'm just going to overwrite mine. css-grid.html and save it. All right, so we're going to need to have some boxes to learn the basics of CSS. We're going to, as we have done with floats and absolute positioning, create what's called a container, and that'll be the first element we produce down here in the body section. So after the body open tag, we're going to put in a div. There is no HTML5 element for this, so we can't simply type this, container. Would have been nice if we could have, but we're going to have to do this as a div with a class or an ID of a container. We'll use a class, div space class equals quote, quote, inside the quotes will go the word container. We'll close that up and move the closing div down here. Now this is again going to be the container, so this is going to be what's called the parent element to the children inside, and the children inside are going to be the individual boxes that are going to make up the layout. So after the container, we're just going to write some generic divs. We're not going to apply class names to them yet. So let's just do div open and div close. So there's one box internal, and this particular div will need some text inside it. I'll put it inside a paragraph tag. I'll put something like, this is the first text. I'm going to copy and paste that just a few times. And that's one box. Now we're going to need more boxes than that. So we're going to go down below that box. This box is remember, a child element of the parent element called container. So I've indented it in a little bit from the container. Next one's going to be another div. And we're going to call this with some text that says something like the following. And I probably could indent the paragraph, but I'm not going to. This is another box. I need just a little bit more text there, so I'll also copy and paste that. That's two boxes. Let's do a third box. So again, just generic element names, no classes or IDs applied to them. I'm going to type up here the following. This is my third box. A little more text needed, so I'll copy and paste that. And finally, we're going to do a fourth box, a fourth child element, another generic div, and here I will type inside paragraph tags, this is my fourth box. And again, typing out something like that with a little more text. All right, so there we have four elements inside the container, like so. All right, let's save that. Let's go back and look at it for just a second. We're not going to notice anything happening here, but let's just take a look at it anyway. All right, so we're going to go to the file we created here, which is called CSS Grid.html, and we're going to open it in Firefox. Well, there are four boxes, and their default behavior is simply to stack one on top of the other vertically right on down the page. Now I'm going to do something here, some CSS, to make it so that the boxes will all get a background color. I could come here and add a class to each of these tags, each having its own background color, but I want to make this easier, so I'm going to go up to the style section. I'm going to type out some CSS you probably haven't seen before, so just follow along for now, then I'll explain it a little bit. So I'm going to type out a class name here of container. Then I'm going to put in a space. I'm going to put in the right angle bracket or greater than symbol, and I'm going to type div. Now this is a strange selector we haven't seen before. This is one of those combined things where we have two things going on. What it's saying is that any divs that follow a container with no other tags between them will have the CSS applied to it. So essentially all the divs that are inside the container, we can write one little bit of CSS, and this will automatically apply that styling to all of the divs inside the container. All right, so we're going to type out the following: background dash color, and I'm going to give it a gray color, and I'm going to use something new here as well called a hexadecimal value. I'll talk about those later. But instead of giving it a named color value, I'm going to put in a pound sign, and I'm going to give it kind of a gray color that would look like this, AAA, and then I'm going to put in my semicolon. And I'm going to give it a little padding as well, all the way around. And I'm going to use 1 EM. The M unit is probably new to you as well. I'm going to just type that in and leave it like that for now. So if we did this correctly, we should see here that that's being applied to all of the divs. So let's take a look at that, save it. Let's go back to And there it is. It has indeed shaded all of the boxes in the container, but I want to make it so that every other box has a different shading to it because it'll be easier to see what's going on with the boxes that way. So I'm going to add a little bit more CSS that'll be new to you here, and this one's going to be dot container space div colon nth dash child. I'll explain this in a moment. Inside parentheses, I'm going to write odd, and I'm going to put a semicolon, not a semicolon, but my two braces in. And I'm going to type, in this case, background color colon pound sign DDD, which will be a lighter gray color than the other one. So type that out, and what's happening here is it's saying that any div, and actually I'm missing something here. We need to have the greater than symbol, and there we go. Any div that follows a container, like the one up above, but specifically those that are the odd numbered boxes, the odd numbered divs after the container, will have this color applied to it instead of this color. So let's just take a look at that and see how that looks. And there you go. You can see we have alternating shading. The nth boxes, the first and third, in other words, the odd numbered nth boxes, the first and third, have a lighter gray color than the other boxes do. So that's going to be useful to us because we don't need to write classes for every div. And we can always remove that again later. It's just for sort of seeing what it is we're going to do here. Okay, so the first thing we need to do with this layout is change it from this situation where it just kind of stretches out down across the page, and we're going to put in columns, all right? So columns are something we commonly need for layout. So we're going to come up here now and we're going to start styling the container. And by the way, let's talk about terminology here. In general terms, we've been calling this the parent, the container, and those divs inside the parent are called children, right? And that's commonly the way we talk about these. When we use CSS Grid, though, we tend to refer to the container as the grid container, and the elements inside are going to be the grid items, all right? So it's good to get that terminology down. The containing box here is going to be called the grid container, and these individual elements are going to be the grid items again. So let's go back up here and write some CSS now. We're going to write the CSS for the container because it needs to be turned into a grid container. So I'm going to type dot container, put in my two braces. How do we turn it into a grid container? Very simply, we always put into the box we want to be the container, the grid container, the following: DISPLAY colon grid. That's pretty much it. Except we need to define for this now how many columns we're going to have. So we're going to use a property called grid-template-columns, colon. And for now, just type in what I type in. We're going to type in 70% space 30% semicolon. Let's save that and take a look at what we have. Aha, we already have something going on. Here's the first box on the top. The second box is over here on the top right. The third box is down here, and the fourth box is here. So CSS Grid automatically, using that property, grid template columns, broke it up into a two-column layout where the first column is wider than the second column. So let's look at why that is. We go back to the HTML and CSS document. It says it's two columns because there are two values here, 70% and 30%. If I change that and put in three values here, like 70%, 20%, and 10%, then it would be three columns. So, but it's two columns because there are two values, percentages here. And it's automatically taken the boxes down below and laid them out on the page using what's called Grid's auto placement algorithm. Grid's auto placement algorithm, saying, okay, the first column is supposed to have a box in it, and it just automatically takes the first one that appears in the HTML. The next box is supposed to be 30%, and the second column is over here, so it's going to be taking the second box and putting it in there, etc. Let's make this a little easier to see. Let's add another property here to the container. We're going to type in grid-column-gap, And again, I'm going to put in a value. I could do that in pixels. I could do 20px perhaps like that. And let's just see what that does. Grid dash column dash gap. We're going to save that. We're going to check it. And you'll notice I put in a gap between the columns that's 20 pixels wide. If we had multiple columns, we'd see a gap like that between all of the columns. We can do the same thing for row. And by the way, I'm going to change this to 1EM. It's just a better unit that I like using. And we're now going to type the same kind of thing, but this time it's going to be grid dash row dash gap. And I'm going to do that at 1EM also. Let's save that. Refresh the page. And now we have both a column gap and a row gap. If I want to make those be different values, I can. I can make the row gap be 2EM perhaps. Let's save it and check it. And now you'll notice the row gap is greater than the column gap is. If I don't want them to be different, I can just do a shorter hand method for typing this out. Instead of using grid column gap and grid row gap, I'm just going to do grid gap. I'm going to type in 1EM. This will apply a 1EM gap for both rows and columns without needing to type out 2 lines of text. So let's save it. And there it is. As you can see, that's exactly what's happening. One of the other things that CSS Grid has given us is the ability to use a new unit. I mean, the units you can use here in percentages, obviously. We could put in absolute pixel numbers. We could use EMs. But there's an interesting new unit called a fractional, FR, that we can use. And I'm going to type this out like so. 1 FR space, 2 FR space, 1 FR. What this is saying to do now is to make 3 columns, auto-placing those boxes that are down here inside this containing parent that are at these units. 1 FR is a 1 fractional that says use 1 fraction of the available space, however wide the browser is, use 1 fraction of it. This column is going to be twice as wide. It's going to be 2 fractions of the available space, and this one is going to be, again, 1 fraction of the available space. So let's keep that in mind as we look at it. Saving our document and going back to Firefox. And there's what happened. We only have 4 boxes inside the grid container. We have 4 grid items, in other words. And it auto-placed those onto rows and columns as we specified in the container. So there it is. The first box is 1 FR in width. The second box is 2 FR in width. And the third box is 1 FR in width. And since there's only one more box, it automatically put that down here under the next row, which has to be 1 FR. All right, what else can we do? Let's talk about what's called the repeat function. Okay, we can repeat these units using what's called the repeat function. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to change the grid template columns a little bit like this. Right now it says 1 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR. Let's get rid of that. And let's type instead after the colon repeat. And be very careful not to put in any space after this repeat or it won't work. I'm going to put in 2 parentheses and then the semicolon. And I'm going to type in this time 2, comma, 1 FR. I'm going to do that a little differently. I'm going to do 2 comma. I'm going to do 1 FR. 1 FR space 2 FR. Now we're going to come back to this in a moment, but we're going to need to do something. So keep this up here for now. Just type like that, and I'll come back and talk about it in a moment. What I'm going to need is a few more boxes. I have 4 boxes on the page, and I'm about to make 2 columns with more boxes. Actually, it's going to be repeating 2 columns, so 4 boxes across the first row. It'll become clear in a moment. But the point is I need some more boxes down here. So let's go down here to the div area, and let's make 4 more boxes. So I'm going to put in very little content here. Div open, div close. And I'm going to type in a paragraph tag, here is another box. And I'm going to copy and paste that div 3 times, so I had a total of 8 div boxes or grid items. I'm going to take that and copy it. Okay, so we've added this number of boxes into the container. There's the closing tag for the div container. These are all inside. We just added those 1, 2, 3, 4 more boxes. Now let's go back up and look what we did a moment ago. This is the repeat function. Let's see what that does to those boxes. So we're going to save this, go back to Firefox, refresh the page, and look what we have there. Now, first of all, we do have 8 boxes, which is good, so it's kind of showing the layout a little better. But look what it's doing. It's taking 1FR, 2FR, and repeating it twice per row. So 1FR, 2FR, 1FR, 2FR across the top. There it is, the first one, the second one, the third one, and the fourth one. If I told it to repeat 3 1FR, 2FR, let's just take a look. We're not going to have enough boxes to really fill out both rows, but let's go ahead and save that. Now it's repeating this pattern of 1FR, 2FR 3 times. Okay, let's go back and change that back to 2. Many times you want to do a situation where you have a lot of columns, like 8 columns, for example, in a layout. We could do this, 1FR, 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 and we could just keep typing that out 8 times. I'm already tired of typing that. So repeat can be very handy because we can put in something like this. There, we don't have to type 1FR 8 times. We simply typed it once, 1FR, but it's repeated 8 times. Let's see what that looks like. And there you go. Every box on the page fits across the top row because we told it to do an 8-column layout, and there's the beginning of an 8-column layout. Let's change that back for simplicity's sake to repeat 2 1FR space 2FR. So quick save, a quick check of that. There we are, we're back to that. I want to tell you about some terminology now. I use the term Grid's auto placement algorithm to describe how Grid automatically takes what we put in here and just places the box on columns and rows. When that happens automatically, it's referred to as the implicit grid. It means that you didn't have to specify precisely where each box should go on the grid, which we can do and which is very powerful, and we're going to look at that in a while. But without needing to specify, it automatically does that for us. It implies, and we don't need to state it explicitly. So there's a difference between the implicit grid and the explicit grid. Later, when we start to place things on the grid in specific locations, that will be the explicit grid. We're now working with the implicit grid. Just terminology for you and something to know. Now let's talk about how we can control row height. So by default now, the height looks something like this, okay? And basically what's going on is it's making the height be as tall as the content needs to be. So the first box here on the first row has a paragraph tag around it, so it's putting some space above it and below it. But that's the height that this box needs in order to fill up the space. These other boxes don't need that much height. The second box doesn't need that much height, but it automatically grows to the same height as the row over here that needs all of that height. And the same goes for the third box and the fourth box, all right? So that's nice because we've shaded these with background colors, and it was very hard before CSS Grid to do this kind of thing. We had situations where maybe the first box would fill up with gray, but the second box would only fill up just below the text that's in it, and you'd have these areas without any shading on them. In fact, the problem was so big that it was referred to as the Holy Grail layout problem, and it's something that Flexbox and CSS Grid have largely fixed. All right, let's go back and talk about grid row height. So to adjust the row height if we need to, because right now it's just kind of automatically doing what it thinks it needs to do, we're going to add another property here to the container. And we're going to add the following: grid dash auto dash rows colon. And I'm going to type something in and then we'll come back and explain it. Remember, this is called a function, right? Just like repeat is a function here, we're about to do a function here. This one is called min-max. So with min-max, and again, no space after the X, we put in the 2 parentheses and put in the semicolon so I don't forget it. We're going to type in the following. I'm going to type in 300 pics, and then I'm going to put in a comma, and I'm going to put space auto. All right, so watch for spaces where they belong and where they don't belong there, and type it out like that. Now, what's going to happen is here, the first value is the minimum in this min-max function. So the minimum any row can be will be 300 pixels, whether it needs that much height or not. And auto simply means that the maximum height will be whatever is needed to make the content fit. So if there's a lot of content, much more than 300 pixels in height, it will still all fit without the text going off somewhere where we don't see it. So let's save that. Let's take a quick look. All right, so there is no box here that needs 300 pixels in height as far as making the content fit, but yet each row is 300 pixels because we said that should be the minimum, right? That should be the minimum. So even these boxes here on the second row all have a height of 300 pixels. So that can be useful when we need to set a minimum height and still making sure that all the content would fit with the maximum height. So again, that's the min-max function. These tags here, or rather these declarations, are very common to CSS Grid, and pretty much any grid website we create is going to have these things in the container. Display grid, you're going to need grid template columns, probably a grid gap, although not necessarily, and grid auto rows can be very helpful as well. The next thing I want to show you is how to make what's called a nested grid. A nested grid. So to do that, we're going to take this document we're working on, which is called CSS-grid.html, and we're going to resave it. File, save as. I'm going to call this one grid nested, grid-nested.html. Grid-nested.html. I'm going to leave the boxes in the HTML section, so I still am going to have 8 boxes down there. But what I'm going to want to do is create a situation where one of the boxes has another grid nested inside of it. So where are we going to put that? Let's go ahead and take this fourth box over here, the fourth box over here, and let's put inside of it a very simple 1-row, 3-column layout. All right? That'll become clear once we create it. You'll see what we're talking about. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to get rid of here the grid auto rows declaration. What I'm going to do now is put inside the grid item for the fourth box another grid, a grid container, if you will. All right. So to do that, we're going to go down to box number 4. And I'm going to take out the content that is currently in the fourth box. There it is right there, the fourth box. I'm going to take it out. So this is a grid item like all of the others here inside the container. What I want to do is turn this into a grid container. So to do that, I'm going to give this div a class name that we can use. I'm going to call it nested. I'm going to do div space class equals, and inside quotes, I'm going to type the word nested. All right, so there's no content in here yet, but I do want to make that into a grid container, so I'm going to need a class name called nested to do that. Inside this div, I'm going to put in a series of child elements, or let's call them grid items. We're putting grid items into now a grid container because we're going to turn this into a grid container as well. So the fourth box is going to be both a grid item of the container and it's going to be a grid container for the nested items. So here we go. We're going to type in div, and I'm going to do this very easily like this on one row. I'm going to type the words box 1 here. Type the words box 2 here. Type the words box 3 here. So I have put 3 boxes inside of here. Now what I'm going to do is go back up here and write the CSS for that class called nested. So dot nested in the CSS section, put in my 2 braces. Well, I said a moment ago that I want to turn this fourth box, which is currently a grid item, also into a grid container. So to do that, I take the nested class and I type, as I did with the main container, display : grid. I'm going to need to have some columns here, so I'm going to type that out as well. We're going to type in the following: grid-template-columns. And very simply, I'm going to type in a 3-column layout. I have 3 divs down there, so I'm going to type 1FR space 1FR space 1FR. I could have done repeat here, but that was easy enough to do. I'm also going to do here a grid auto rows. Grid dash auto dash rows. And I'm going to type in min max, no spaces, put in my parentheses and a semicolon, go back inside the parentheses and type out the following: 70 pix, comma, space, auto. So a min max, a minimum of at least 70 pixels height and a maximum of auto. Let's give it a grid gap as well. So let's simply add that, grid dash gap, colon 1 EM. Now, I should probably color the boxes as well, but let's just see. Right now, you're not going to see that they're boxes. So actually, let's do this. Let's put a border on this. Border, colon, solid, space, 1 pix, space, black. Let's just see what that does. But before we do, let's take a look at the CSS we just wrote. So we made a new class called nested. We are making it a grid container, so we had to type display colon grid. And then we put in these other declarations to make it work the way we want it to look. I went down to the 4th box, which was a grid item. It's still a grid item of the parent container, of the grid container. But now we've turned this box into a grid container as well. And it's going to put 3 boxes on a row, each at 1 FR, that looks something like that. Let's save this. Let's go back and look at it. Need to look at the right file. We called this grid-nested.html. All right, so again, it's a little hard to see. And actually, my underline went around the whole box, which wasn't what I wanted there. I could write that CSS a little differently. Let me go back and do that quickly, just so we can see what's going on. Much like I did up here for nested, I could, or for the container, I could come down here and add a little more CSS. I'll do something like this: dot nested space right angle bracket div, put in my 2 braces, and I'm going to now do here the border, which is where I really wanted it. Border colon solid 1 pix black. I'll remove it from up here. Let me also give it a little padding. So padding, I'll do. I'm using padding here instead of grid gap. Let's just see what that does. Let's save this and take a quick look. Well, there you have it. This is a nested grid. So the master grid, the container, has all of these items within it. The 4th item, which is still a grid item, is also a container by putting display colon grid on it. And we have 3 boxes that go inside of that. So sometimes you may have a basic 4-column layout, but you may want to have more columns up here, for example, within a box, and that's a quick and easy way to do it. Let's talk next about how to justify and align content, something that has been very difficult to do as well before Flexbox, especially, and then before CSS Grid. All right, we're going to go back next to the document in brackets. And we're going to take this and we're going to learn how to justify and align content using CSS Grid. To do that, we're going to resave this document, file save as. And instead of calling it grid-nested, we're going to call it grid-justify-align. Save it. And we're going to leave the boxes down below, but essentially we're going to change this 4th box back to just a regular grid item. So let's get rid of the class name of nested. And let's get rid of these 3 divs inside it, but instead put a paragraph of text inside. This is my 4th box. And let's get rid of the nested stuff we typed up here just to clean up the document. So all of this nested class and the nested greater than div. All right, so now we're back to this. Let's make this a, instead of a repeat 2FR, 1FR, or 2 1FR, 2FR, let's change that And let's do a simple situation here where we don't use the repeat function, but instead we're going to simply type out that we're going to have 1FR space 2FR space 1FR. So a 3-column layout set up essentially like that. So if we could get that document back to that state, we change the container just a little bit. It's a 3-column layout now. We have 8 boxes down below. Let's save that and let's just check our work, see where we are. And I have to put in the new name here. And let's go back and see where the mistake is. There it is. I've got an extra parentheses in there. So we remove that. We'll resave it. We'll check it in the browser. And there we have it. So that's what we asked it to do. It's now a 3-column layout. So let's talk about justifying alignment. The term justify refers to what might be called horizontal alignment. In other words, how does content align on the page from side to side? The term align refers to vertical alignment, and that makes sense, I guess, when we use the term alignment to describe it. But it's going to take and essentially align items on the vertical dimension. So let's come down here and add something to make this work. So let's go back to brackets. And let's type into the container the following. So another declaration, if you will, under the grid item or grid gap. And we're going to turn on justify dash items colon start semicolon. That will justify all items inside this container, and we have different properties we can use besides start. Besides start, we could use, if we wanted to, center or end or something called stretch. It's basically to kind of reset things back. But let's start with start. Okay, so that's justify items inside the container at the start position horizontally. The next item is going to be align dash items colon, and we'll also do start here. And we have the same property values we could use here, including, again, start, center, end, and stretch. Let's just do that much for now. And let's save our document. Let's go back and look at it in Firefox. And that's what we have. Now, the boxes are going to fill up as much content as they have. So, for example, this first box is wider than the boxes below it because it has more content in it. But it is at the start position. And we're going to fix that so this will become a little clearer to you and it won't be confusing. Let's go back to our document. And let's make the text inside each of our boxes much simpler. So just, again, to make sure we see this properly, we're going to still use p tags. We'll simply call this one box 1. Let's take the content in box 2 between the p tags and put in box 2. And we're going to keep doing that. So just take a moment to type that out. Box 3. This one will say box 4. Box 5, box 6, box 7, and one more to do. Box 8. We're going to save that. Now I think it's a little clearer what's happening here. So there's not a lot of content in these boxes vertically, so we're mainly seeing the effect of the horizontal alignment. And box 1, box 2, and box 3 are horizontally aligned at their start position. So this is basically the 1FR area, basically from where it says box 1 over to just next to box 2. The 2FR area takes up much more space than we're seeing box 2 take up, but since there's only a little bit of content in that box, it's justified way over to the start position. Let's go back to our document and make a change there to the justify dash content, or justify items rather. And instead of start, Let's type in center. Let's save it. Go back to Firefox, refresh, and watch what happens. So that content now is still within its 1FR box, but essentially it is scooted over into the center position of its space that's available. Let's go back to brackets. And let's change center to something else. Let's change it to end. Check it in the browser. And now it has essentially taken up space that it needs, but it is essentially aligned way over to the end position as we indicated it should do. All right, so that's justify items. Align items and the properties or values we would use there, we're going to need to change some of the content a little bit. So I'm going to take a box or two here and add a little bit more content. So this says box 1, I'm going to put in a period there, or rather box 2, put in a period there. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that several times. We're going to check this in Firefox. Okay, so box 2 is growing taller now because it needed more content, but you can notice that box 1 is scooted up here at the top. So let's go back to our brackets document and let's make the effect even more dramatic. Let me put a paragraph tag around box 2 that actually let me copy the entire paragraph and paste it again. So now box 2 has quite a bit of content in it, as you can see there. Save it, go back to Firefox. Okay, so you can especially see now with box 1 and box 3 what's going on there. So let's change some property values there. So we're dealing with vertical alignment. So align items is set to start. Let's change that to end. Save it, check it in the browser. Watch what happens now to box 1 and box 3. They scooted down into the end position of that box space they had. So that's alignment vertically, and we can do the other properties there as well if you want to see how that looks. So again, we have center is available to us. Let's put in start. Start is going to put things back into the start position. We'll see that very obviously. Save it. All right, so that's alignment of content using CSS Grid. The next thing we're going to do is learn how to use what are called grid lines for layout. So far, grid looks very powerful. It allows us to automatically place items on rows and columns, but sometimes we want to explicitly state where material should go. In other words, we want to hang certain boxes onto certain elements or areas, I should say, of the grid. So to do that, we're going to go back here and take a look at what are called grid lines. So this is a system that uses grid lines. And also, by the way, I want to go back to a website here. This website, CSS Grid, that is at grid-layout.com, has a section under it called Layout with Grid Lines. Let's talk about the basic principle here. So using grid lines in CSS means that we can specify specifically on which lines a box should start. So for example, if we had a 4-column, 4-row grid, such as shown here, the idea is that we would number the lines. What's important is the line numbers, not so much the column numbers, because a 4-column grid actually has 5 grid column lines, right? As you look up here, across the top, column lines are line 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for a 4-column layout. So the first box goes from column line 1 to column line 2. The second box goes from column line 2 to column line 3, etc. There's always one more column line than columns. The same thing goes for rows here. We've labeled those row line 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, even though it's only a 4-row layout. Let's suppose we wanted to use and start with a grid that was like that, 4 rows or 4 columns. And we wanted to take certain grid items, certain boxes, certain elements, and hang them on the grid so they might look like this, for example. The beauty of CSS Grid is by using the explicit grid, we can explicitly state that the grid item number 1 should go from column line 1 to column line 3, and should go from row line 1 to row line 3. So essentially spanning 2 columns and 2 rows of this grid. Grid item number 2, we might want to place that on the grid in a situation like that. For example, it goes from column line 3 to column line 5, and it goes from row line 1 to row line 3, etc. And maybe the third grid item would go down on the bottom there between column lines 3 and 5 and row lines 1 and 5. So how do we code that? How do we make that happen is kind of the question. Well, here's what we're about to make. We're going to create this layout using something called grid lines. Instead of doing what we've done before where we specify things like 1FR, 2FR, and let grid automatically place items on the grid, this time we're going to use grid line numbers, and we're going to specify specific areas on the grid where we want to hang these individual grid items. So you'll notice box 1 goes from column line 1 to column line 3. It goes from row line 1 to 2. So all we'll need to specify there is the column line numbers. Box 2 goes from column line 3 to column line 7. Box 2, on the other hand, while it goes from column line 1 to column line 4, also needs to be specified for its row lines because it goes from row line 2 to row line 4. If we didn't specify, it would only put it on the second row there. Box 4, similarly, it does have a column line number of 4 and 7, but it also needs to have row line designations for 2 to 4. And box 5 and 6 will be pretty simple. We'll just specify the column line numbers because those will automatically get placed there after the explicit placement of boxes 3 and 4. So box 5 will go from column line 1 to 3, and box 6 will go from column line 3 to column line 7. So to start this, let's go back and open up our setup.html file in brackets. This document is pretty close to being back where it was. The one thing I'm going to add to this is this information. I just copied this from elsewhere and just pasted it right now. So if you don't have that in your document, place it in there because remember that's just the shading that will occur so we can see exactly what our boxes are doing. The document does have a class of containers, so once you have all of that stuff typed in or you copied it from another document, we want to get back to this point though. So I'm ready to save this with a different name, so File, Save As. And we're going to call it gridlines.html, grid-lines.html. We're going to save it. Well, the first thing we need to do for this layout, let's go back and look at it again. We have how many boxes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes. So let's quickly make 6 boxes in our HTML. So inside the container down here, we're going to make a box, and it's going to say box 1. Now, it needs to have a class designation for this, so I'm going to give it a class right now, class equals, and I'm going to spell out the word 1 like that. And there's our first box. So let me just copy that and paste it a few times. And I can change these now so that they represent the class names we want. Box 2 will have a class name of box 2, TWO. Box 3 will have that. Box 4 will get a class of 4, etc. We just keep doing this. I need to label the box above that 5, like so. And let's just check and see if the shading is working properly right now. So again, you should have added this if you didn't have it already to provide the shading. And then this is the HTML, very simple 6-box setup with a container outside of it. And we're going to save it. And then we're going to check it in a browser. So let's open gridlines.html in Firefox. And there the shading work, we have 6 boxes, no real placement done with them. We haven't done anything with CSS Grid as of yet. So back to brackets. Well, let's go ahead and set up the container CSS now. We have done some styling to make the boxes gray, but now just the grid container styling. So we type out the class of container. And of course, as all grid containers do, this one starts with display : grid. Now let's go ahead and set up the columns we need. So let's do that with grid-template-columns. And we're going to use the repeat function here. So repeat, and then the 2 parentheses and a semicolon. And inside the parentheses, we're going to type 6, 1 FR. So 6 columns, each of them taking up 1 fraction of the available space. Let's go ahead and do the grid auto rows as well. So type that out. And we're going to use the min-max function once again. And inside the parentheses, we're going to type a minimum height of 150 pixels, comma, space auto. Let's give it a grid gap as well. We'll do the 1 EM. And let's put a maximum width on it of 900 pixels. And we'll center up that layout with a margin : 0 space auto, like so. It's probably a good idea to check where we are, so we're going to save that. And there we go. We have 6 boxes on a row, all taking up 1 fraction of the available space. Now, to create the document that looks like this, we need to place these boxes on the grid using column line numbers and row line numbers in some cases. So we're going to go back to brackets. And now we're going to start to write out that information. Well, box 1 has a class applied of .one. So let's do that class first. Here's how we hang grid items on top of the grid. We just simply put in grid-column, and since we're going to need a start line and an ending line, we can do that like this: 1/3. That says go from grid column line 1 to column line 3. You'll automatically place it on the first row implicitly, but we've explicitly stated that it should go from grid columns 1 to grid column 3. Let's check and see if that works. So we're going to save that. And as you can see, it's taking up the space we want it to take. Let's do the others in a similar fashion. Let's go down and do the class of 2. And this time, grid column lines for this will be 3/7. Remember, it's going to start on column line 3 and it's going to end in column line 7. So let's see if that worked. We'll save it. We'll check it. And there it is, stretching out across. Box 1 and 2 are now on the top row, and it's beginning to look much more like the layout that we had envisioned back here. Like that. Let's keep going. We'll do the rest of them now. Let's do .3. And 3, if you'll recall, is going to start on column line 1. So we're going to type that in grid-column, and it's going to go from 1 to 4 in this case. Now what we're going to need to do here, because it needs to go onto 2 rows, is we're going to need to specify grid row lines as well for this box and the one next to it. So grid row, and specifically it's going to go from 2 to 4. Let's take a look at that. So grid column lines 1 to 4, grid row lines 2 to 4. There it is right there, box 3. It goes from indeed grid column line 1 to grid column line 4 and grid row line 2 to grid row line 4. Let's do .4 class. Grid 4 is going to start where grid 3 ended at column line 4, so it's going to go 4 to 7. Remember, there's always one more column line than there are columns. And so even though it's a 6-column grid, the last column line is column line 7. And this one will need the same grid row designation as box 3. So we're going to type grid row 2/4 like that. And let's see what we have so far. Refresh. And indeed, these are taking up 2 rows. They are in the right column lines and the right row lines. Let's fix the last 2 boxes. And these last 2 are supposed to look like this. 5 and 6 at the bottom like that. Let's go ahead and write that out. So the class of dot 5 will go from grid column 1 to grid column line 3. We don't need to specify the row lines. It'll automatically take up just 1 row below the other boxes that are already placed on the grid. And finally, dot 6, grid column, and this one's going to go from grid column line 3 to column line 7. Let's check it. Refresh. And there you go. There's our layout just as we wanted it. Okay, the second way we're going to learn to do this is called grid areas. So for that lesson, we're going to resave this document. File, save as. It's called grid-lines right now. Let's refer to it as grid-areas, A-R-E-A-S, grid-areas.html. And we're going to do a little bit of a different layout, but we can use some of the HTML and maybe some of the CSS that we've used here. Let's actually go down and remove the HTML. And just to do something different, let's use HTML5 element names for this one, okay? So we're going to get rid of everything between the div, class of container, open and close tags. And we're going to go up to the CSS. And we're going to get rid of all of the classes we made for the grid lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm going to get rid of part of this because it's going to change. So I'm back to this point. I've got part of the container CSS written. I left the display colon grid and the grid template columns in there, which we'll make a little change to. And for the HTML, we've just really taken out almost everything except the container box. So let's make sure we save that. All right, what are we going to need for HTML? Let's make some boxes. The layout we're going to go for is going to look like this. So essentially there's a header across the top. It's a 4-column layout, not a 6-column layout. And there's an aside and a nav over there, and there's a main which spans 2 rows essentially. The main goes next to both aside and nav, so we'll have to address that with our CSS. There's a section that's 2 rows high, and then there's a footer. So we ought to be able to create that. So let's go back, and let's make the box names first. So the first one, we said we're going to use HTML5 element names. We're going to type out header. Again, I could use divs. I'm only doing this so you can review HTML5 element names if you want to use those instead of generic element names like divs with a class of something. So the first box inside the container is a header tag. And the header is just going to have the word inside it that says header. In fact, I can make this easier by not putting these down onto other rows. Let me just put this all up here like this. This works exactly the same way. So there's our header box. Let's do another box called main. That's an HTML5 element name we didn't use before, but it's available to you for certain content. I'm just going to type the word main in there. Next HTML5 element name I'm going to use is going to be section, which we have used before. And inside there, I'm just going to type the word section, so it shows up. The next name we're going to use is going to be aside. I'll simply type the word aside in there. And we're going to need another box for nav. I'll type the word navigation in between that. And finally, we're going to have a box called footer. and I'll simply put the word footer inside it. Well, those are our boxes, very simple to do. Let's save it so we have that up to date. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to write some CSS to make what's called grid areas happen. So grid areas works differently than grid lines because instead of using grid column line numbers and grid row line numbers, we can name each box and then assign each box a certain location on the screen with some CSS. I think that will become clearer as we do it. The first thing we need to do, though, is take each of these and write a class for them. So we're going to come up here and we're going to do just simply the HTML5 element name. It's not a class. I'm going to type header like that. We're going to write some CSS for the header. And all I need to type is the following, grid-area, and I'm going to type the word header here. What is this doing? Well, nothing really yet, but it's an important thing to do for each box, which is to give it a grid area name. I could call this anything I want. It would make it work fine. Instead of header, I could call it top. I could call it Steve. I could call it anything I want, but it's easier to keep track of it if I give it the same name as the element name itself. Since the element's name is header, let's give it a grid area name of header. Let's make it easy on ourselves. All right, so that one's name. We need to do that now for each box, essentially. So it's a little bit cumbersome. I can copy and paste it, I guess. So this one, instead of being called header, is going to be, we're going to style the main. So the tag is called main. And for the grid area name, again, let's use the same name as the element name, main. Next one is section. And keeping true to form, we're going to give it the same name here. Next one is called aside, so we're going to name the aside element, giving it a name of aside. Do the same thing for the nav. Now the element name is nav. Even though we wrote the word navigation inside it. So I could use either the area name navigation or nav, but let's use nav because again I said we want to make it the same thing as the element name, which is nav. And there's one more to do here for the footer, so we'll add that. All right, let's save that. Now we haven't really done anything yet except set it up. We're ready to do the layout now. So how do we type the layout? Well, let's go up to the container. There's nothing to look at here yet, so we won't really look at it. All right, I said we would use part of this. We are going to use display grid, so that's already in there for us. But we wanted a 4-column layout this time, so I'll use the repeat function. And I'll do 4, 1FR. I could have written out 1FR 4 times. That would work as well, but I'm going to use the repeat function here. Let's type in as well the property for grid-auto-rows. And let's use the min-max function again. Remember, no space after that. Put in our 2 parentheses. Whoops. Semicolon. Okay, the minimum is going to be 100 pixels, so I write 100 pics. Don't forget it's a comma next and then a space, auto. Let's give it a grid gap. It's a little easier to see what's going on with our boxes if we have a grid gap on it. So grid-gap, : and I will use the 1EM again. I could set up the max width if I want. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll set the max width at 900 pixels. We'll center it when it does become a max width. We can center it with a margin : 0 space auto. Well, we're still not done, but let's see what we have so far just to kind of keep up to date. So we'll go back and look at, this is a file called grid-areas. So we'll change that here, grid-areas. Right now, all of these are stacking up over here, and it looks very odd. But let's go back and finish the CSS we need to make this happen. We've named the areas, but the important element here that we need is the following. So we're going to add this. This is basically the difference between the grid line system and grid areas. This requires what's called grid dash template dash areas colon. And I'm going to actually type the next stuff underneath it because we're going to have a fair amount of stuff to type in there. So what we're going to do here is put inside quotes all of the boxes that will appear on the first row, and it'll become clear in a moment. I'm going to need a semicolon at the end of this, so I'm going to put that in now before I forget. All right, so if you remember the layout, let me just save this. This is what we want to happen. We want the header box to go all the way across all 4 columns, taking up just 1 row. So this is really cool, and this is what people really like about grid template areas or grid areas. It's kind of like what's called ASCII artwork in that you're almost designing the layout of the page with the text that you type here. So let's type it and it'll become more clear. So the header box, which is down here, the header element has been called a grid area of header. So using the grid area name header, I can type the following: header space, header space, header space, header. So I've written out header 4 times with spaces in between. Now that looks sort of like we expect it to look on the web page itself, doesn't it? The header will take up 4 columns spanning all the way across like that. Okay, I'm going to do another row like that. So I drop my semicolon down below. Don't forget the semicolon at the end of all of this. The second row, what does that look like? What's the second row supposed to do? It's supposed to be an aside for the first 2 columns and then main. So aside, aside, main, main, right? Let's type that in. Aside, aside, all of these with spaces between main, main. Now, the second, or rather the third row, let's go back and look at that one. The third row is going to be nav, nav, and the main is going to stay on that row as well. So main needs to appear again there. So it's going to be nav, nav, main, main for the third row, right? So we back up, we go to brackets, and we type that out. So nav, nav, main, main. So again, it kind of looks like the layout of the page, doesn't it? Header all the way across, aside next to main, nav next to main. We keep going like that. The next row. So let's go back and look at that. So the section is going to go like so, section, 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 but on 2 different rows. So let's go back. Section, space, section, space, section, space, section. I can copy and paste that because I need to have it go on another row. So now it's doing that. And finally, the last row is going to be taken up with the footer. Footer, space, footer, space, footer, space, footer. All right, let's save that and let's go back and take a look. Now, we don't have any shading, so it's a little hard to see what's happening there. Probably should add some shading to that as well. Let's go back to our brackets document so we can see it. And here's the deal. Here's what's happening. The reason the shading isn't working. The shading that we applied it to said to do any divs that followed the container, but we didn't use divs. We're using HTML5 element names. I'll show you a quick little trick here. If I make this be an asterisk, it's going to say any elements that immediately follow the container, not just divs. So that would include HTML5 element names as well. So I just did an asterisk or a star there. Let's save that. Back and look at it. And now the shading came back. All right. And that's exactly the layout we said we wanted, wasn't it? So there's a header, a side navigation, main going across 2 rows, section using 2 rows but going all the way across the page, and then a footer at the bottom. Those tools, grid lines and grid areas, are very powerful and they're very easy to use, and they will allow you to make layouts that are fully responsive, right? So if we look at that, shrink down a little bit, you might expect that to look on a phone a certain way. like that. No, we haven't moved the boxes around. We're going to talk later about media queries and doing mobile first responsive layout. But essentially, we've learned some very good tools that are somewhat responsive. It does shrink the page. In this case, there's also a max width. If I wanted this to continue to stretch across the page, I would remove that max width and the margin 0 auto. But that's pretty well what we want to do.